Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Does the phrase demography is destiny work for the dozens of colleges and universities located in Pennsylvania and in particular the Delaware Valley region who are facing a demographic decline that extends up to 2041? The Philadelphia Inquirer has an excellent team of journalists that cover this industry deeply. They will provide insight and takeaways for my listeners on this timely topic in today's podcast. Joining me today are Susan Snyder, who covers the issues and trends affecting colleges. As she says, if it happens on campus, I'm interested. Sue, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. And Harold Brubaker, who covers the business side of healthcare, but also co-authored the recent Inquirer series titled Financially Fragile, an examination of the financial health of 13 small private Philadelphia area universities. Harold, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Glad to have you both. So let's start with the fact that small private colleges in the Philadelphia area are undergoing significant financial pressures, with many relying on cost-cutting, innovative program development, and philanthropy to stabilize. Some institutions can stand out for their financial resilience. Others show promising signs of recovery through strategic adaptations. Still others seem to be looking at a dim future. Sue, today you published a piece covering a newly released report highlighting that Pennsylvania is projected to see a more than 17% or 24,000 student decline in high school graduates between now and 2041. Walk us through what your coverage said today.
Yeah, I mean, basically, colleges have known for a while that we were going to begin to see this dip in 2026 in high school graduates, right? That's what the birth data was showing. What Witchy published, their most recent report, is basically kind of gave more details about that. They publish a snapshot every 4 years. And yeah, it showed, I think, nationwide that we're going to see a 13% drop in high school graduates, going from roughly about 9 million all the way down to like 3.4 million in 2041. And then, within that, there was different differentiations among different states and different regions, but Northeast region is certainly one of the harder hit regions. And Pennsylvania is, looking at a 17% drop between 2023 and 2041. Nearby in New Jersey, they're only looking at a 1% drop. So there's a difference there. But the region as a whole, I think it definitely is another challenge, for colleges that already have been trying to figure out, how to deal with dropping tuition revenue and, other, financial challenges and enrollment challenges.
Well, Harold, in the article that you and Sue co-authored, there were 3 general financial challenges and trends that you identified, along with Penn graduate Dr. Julie Gard, True Coverage. She was one of my students at Penn. The 3 areas that we focused on were shrinking revenue pools, small endowments, and mergers and closures. So I'll leave you, Harold, to start wherever you'd like with those.
Well, that ties into what Sue was just talking about in terms of the student pool. It's just been declining, and it's been particularly hard in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Philadelphia region, where we don't have a lot of population growth. So these schools are competing for a shrinking pool of high school graduates, and that's put just loads of pressure on their core revenue, which is net tuition. And that's not going to ease. So it's going to be really challenging. That's why so many of the schools are trying to have supplemental programs. They all love graduate programs of all kinds, because for one thing, they're not typically discounting graduate programs, and they can collect the full sticker price. So it's going to be really rough. And all these schools have, when you don't have the endowment to cushion anything, they just face a really hard time. And in fact, some schools do have restricted reserves or unrestricted reserves, but now they're running through those unrestricted reserves to patch holes in their budgets. So it's not going to get better, I think, for a while for some of these schools.
Yeah, because you're right. You don't have as many full pay tuition students coming in. You've got smaller endowments. You said as some of them have as small as $16 million in their endowments, some over $100 million. But still the idea that you don't have reserves, unrestricted reserves to draw from. makes it really challenging. Harold, in the research, talk a little bit about the differences. You had different categories based on Julie's research of schools that were faring well down to schools that were struggling.
Yeah, so Julie's system, what she came up with is really just sort of a color coded system for rating the financial viability of all these different schools, small schools. She focused on schools with 2,000 students or less, and and she it was a scale of 0 to 100, rating the financial health of the schools. And I guess 75 and above, you ended up in the blue category, and then it went down to green, orange, red, or yellow and red. All the way down to poor financial health. It's just a way of rating financial health. And what really stood out at the top, those schools generally had growing revenue because they had some innovative programs, and they also lived within their means. Their expenses, like one of the interesting measures that Julie developed was taking what she called student revenue coverage, which meant so your student revenue, your net tuition and your auxiliary revenues from room and board and things like that, and how well does that cover your overall expenses? For most schools, it's a little bit of a loss, but one of the schools at the very top, like some years, it was in the black, and a couple of the schools were actually covering all their expenses with student revenue, which is an awesome position to be in. At the bottom, those schools had massive declines in net tuition revenue, and they had big losses from trying to cover expenses with student revenue. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's how. I mean, there's other more complicated measures she uses involving the balance sheet and things like that. But it's very focused on cash and the amount of cash you have coming in the door to cover operating expenses.
Sue, you've been covering closures in the Philadelphia area, the University of the Arts, Cabrini. There are rumors about others. What's your take on this measurement tool?
In terms of whether, well, I mean, Julie has said straight out that she doesn't, consider it to be like, she doesn't use it to predict which colleges are going to close next, right? She said that. But, she also has found that, when she looked during her dissertation, she found that, a good number of these colleges that ended up closing had been red, before, just prior to closure. She did find that. So, but again, she's saying it's not, a predictor of whether a college will close.
And if I could interject here, actually, there's a fair amount of volatility in the index over the years that we looked at. She gave us data going back to 2015. For some of the schools, there's a decent amount of volatility, and I guess that has to do with the fact that the way she has it devised, it has to do with trends. Part of the measure has to do with the trends over 3 years, and that can be pretty volatile for some of these small schools.
Okay.
A little bit in one way or the other can affect your financial results and thus your score on her index.
And, Cabrini and University of Arts were both in the red category, but prior to their closure, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, schools in your article that you listed in poor financial health as attributed to Julie, LaSalle, Rosemont, Delaware Valley, Newman. I assume you spent time interviewing the presidents and other folks on campuses. What was their takeaway? What kinds of adjustments are they trying to make at this point?
Yeah, I can start on that, and then Harold, if you want to add to it. I mean, I think we heard a mixed reaction from the schools in terms of that. First of all, the reaction to Julie's system. Some were not, were trying to discount it. Didn't really believe that it was an accurate measure. Others accept it. Others, acknowledged it was a challenging time, and that they certainly were having, some financial difficulties, and they were making changes, and they were doing, a bunch of different things. Some of them had talked about, basically like at Newman, they really looked over every aspect of their budget and made some cutbacks, in terms of, trying to, like, from things as simple as like saying, okay, we're not going to have shuttles anymore, transporting students on campus. We're gonna go, I think it was from buses to vans to transport athletes. I think that's what it was. So to try to make some savings that way. Made changes in their cafeteria, their dining hall program, in terms of at the hours it operates. things like that. I mean, LaSalle had made a lot of changes. We did a very, an in-depth story on LaSalle back in April before, the series published. They talk about sports. One of their approaches was to, revive baseball, bring that back, add a bunch of different women's sports. They did a lot of upgrades to their basketball arena. They have their basketball coach. They kept Fran Dunphy, right, who's really important to them. And, so I mean, they did a lot of that. They also brought back the band, right? They're bringing back the band, right? They're doing that. And so, in addition to that, they did, I think, some consolidation of some of their, programs, schools. They did that. They, took that kind of a step. They think they did some restructuring, and Harold can talk more about this. Bond debt, right, Harold? I think they did some of that, right?
Yes.
Um, Go ahead.
If I can address that real quickly.
Yeah.
LaSalle made a fairly unusual move where it did in its recent bond refinancing. It basically gave itself, I think, maybe 5 years of breathing room on some of the debt payments that it was required to make. But that does mean, I think, in 2029, its debt service will increase. But it gives them some breathing room to get their financial
That's
house in
interesting.
better shape.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
And I think, Delaware Valley is trying to, use some of its land, monetize its land, try to, basically bring other entities on campus, to try to, raise revenue that way. I think, Rosemont, it has been trying different things under its president, Jim Cawley, who's only been there a couple years, in terms of having a strategic plan where they look more carefully at what they're spending. So I think there's a lot of different, a variety of approaches. So some schools are looking at trying to bring in these lower cost graduate programs, MBA programs, to try to increase revenue. Some have had, like Eastern's had some success with that, right? So yeah, I think there's a bunch of different approaches these schools are trying, and we'll probably see more and more of this as time goes on, as the pool of available high school graduates continues to decrease.
A couple of things I would add back to sports. As you mentioned sports, an interesting thing is that I know at Newman they mentioned that adding coaches is like adding recruiters of students. So they're not just coaches; they're also expected to bring students to the campus, which I think is, as that obviously that's sort of obvious that that's part of the job if you think about it, but it's part of the strategy to increase enrollment. And
Absolutely.
the other thing I would mention in terms of the reaction to Julie Garrett's index is anytime you're looking at audited financial statements, it's retrospective. A lot of the presidents, at least one of the presidents, very vociferously objected to that because he's always thinking they basically know what their revenue and expenses are going to be in September. Okay, so they're thinking that we were using data that was way too old, even though we were using the most recent available public data.
Right.
So I think that's one of the things that was hard for some of the schools to swallow. That we were looking at a fiscal 2023, which for them was like almost 2 years old because they're now thinking about fiscal 25.
Right. Right. Did they talk much about FAFSA and the FAFSA rollout?
Heard from a good number of schools, not necessarily just the ones we reported on in that story, but for instance, Drexel, which I reported extensively on their budget challenges and the layoffs they're doing there, a lot of their steps they're taking, their consolidation they're doing there, and their programming just because of their budget challenges. But they absolutely called out FAFSA as being a major issue for why their first year students took such a dive this past year. And I've certainly heard that from other places. We've heard that from other places along the way that the botched FAFSA rollout has really complicated things for them, and at a time when they really didn't need to have that added problem at this
For
point.
sure. For
Yeah.
sure. A couple of schools you noted were stable: Chestnut Hill, Ursinus, Immaculata, and they were even showing some signs of financial improvement. What were some of the things you noticed there?
Well, I was just going to say that I mean, one of the things that helped Chestnut Hill financially, according to this model, is they brought in a lot of philanthropy in connection with the retirement of a long-time president. That over a few years, that has helped their financial picture. With Ursinus, they've benefited. They do have the biggest endowment. It's not a big endowment, but they have the biggest endowment among these schools, and that has helped them sort of weather the storm. Immaculata is interesting because that's one of the schools that, in an earlier iteration was of this data analysis, was red in the quote unquote red zone, but it has since climbed out of that. I mean, but Immaculata faces the same challenges of all these smaller schools. So time will tell.
Yeah.
And Ursinus, I think, did some cutbacks too, right?
Ursinus did
As
some
well.
buyouts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Changes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That seems to be a common strategy, is to try to get people to take early retirement buyouts, that type of thing. Even in the Penn State system,
Yes.
there's been a real push for that. I know, Sue, you've covered that.
Yeah, on the Commonwealth campuses, we
Yes.
have seen a real decline in enrollment. There's, they had just had a big buyout. I can't remember off the top of my head the number of people that took it, but it was a good percentage of
Yeah.
people that work there. And I just wrote a story about how one of the things they're going to be trying in the future is, to try to grow first year enrollment on at the University Park campus, because they feel like that the admit rate there is roughly around 50%. So they still have, pretty high demand for people that want to go to University Park. So they're going to be building a new resident. Well, they're not building it, but they've got a ground lease with another company to build, have a residence hall built there.
Yes.
And that will really, allow them to grow. They want to go from, right now they're roughly at about 9,300, and they'd like to over a period of years go to 10,000 students at University Park. So
Yeah. In the residence halls, right?
Yes. I don't. Like basically about 10,000 first years. I don't know. And first years tend to be in the residence halls. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting story for a couple reasons. One, yes, the Commonwealth campuses are experiencing the same kind of decline that many of the small privates are, which seems counterintuitive because of the Penn State brand, but it's understandable. I wondered if in your reporting you found out that the reason University Park is more desirable is because of big time football. It makes me wonder if that's part of the central experience that they can differentiate with the Commonwealth campuses, for example.
Yeah, I probably. I mean, I would say that probably is part of it. I mean, I know, I have friends whose kids have gone to Penn State. They went to Penn State. Some of their parents went to Penn State. I mean, it's sort of like, just a family tradition, and the bond among the alumni at Penn State is just so strong, and it's such a big school. I mean, I just think, yeah, and as when I'm talking to their admissions person out there, like, they just said, we have the brand, this is the brand, we have to leverage that and try to use that and grow our, grow our enrollment here. That's what, what they were saying. And so I just think, yeah, they've definitely, that has remained a campus where people want to go and people want to send their kids generally. Right. So,
Yeah. It really does have deep, deep roots in
Yeah.
Pennsylvania for sure.
Yeah.
Harold, what else could you tell from the growth strategies and the cost cutting strategies do you think my listeners would want to know?
I think one of the interesting thing that we've heard from a couple of the presidents was that they've truly started to look at their operations as a business. I'm a longtime business writer. I've covered
Yes.
financial news for many years, and I can remember years ago when, even with health systems, which I write mostly about, they would sort of resist thinking about themselves as a business. But eventually they came around. Even though they're nonprofits, they're still a business. And I think colleges and universities are starting to think that way, that they realize that they've got to comb through all of their expenses and have solid strategies for attracting more students to spend money there.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing. And it's going to be interesting to see what works, because a lot of them some of them anyway, are sort of are chasing after what they consider hot programs. And we'll see how long if those things really have legs. For example, cybersecurity is a
Yeah.
big
Yeah.
popular program right now. Schools are starting new programs in that. Who knows? I know Drexel is pretty big already, has been for many years in that area. Whether these new schools can catch up and attract students,
Yeah.
we'll see. And I think in the end run, it's going to depend for these schools whether they're actually creating value for their graduates, right? And that's
Right. Right, right. How much did you all hear about, if any at all, about the impact of mini certificates, small bite-sized programming impacting the college degree process? Did you hear much about that?
I'm sorry. Say in terms of what? I'm sorry. Say that
So
again.
the college, in other words, the traditional 4-year degree
Mhm.
versus getting credentialed for different kinds of things using artificial intelligence, those kinds of things. That's been sort of the undercurrent in some of these discussions that perhaps a 4-year degree isn't quite worth what it used to be.
That is absolutely the conversation we're hearing. I mean, I think one of the stats I had in the story today was about how I think it was in 2017, and I can't cite the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there was I think 65, 66% of high school graduates were going on to college, right? And then by and I might be a little off in that percentage. It was somewhere in the 60s there, but and then by 2022, I think it was down to like 55%. So fewer people going to get those college degrees. And one of the things too, I think, is there's been coverage in the Chronicle of Higher Education about this and other places, like about how there's just this sort of people are questioning the value of college more than before, and maybe part of that could be political, right? We know part of that is, I know I've seen some studies that certainly more people that are on the Republican side, right, definitely are questioning that, but I've also seen like more Democrats on that side are also, so I mean, college is really, and I think cost is one of the big factors there, right? And I think if people now are looking at, well, if there's a way to get this credential, get launched in the job market more quickly, then maybe that's a better alternative route. Now, I think colleges would argue that you get a lot more out of college than just a degree, that it's an experience, that you're learning a lot more than just that, but that's they've got to, I think, really start to demonstrate or sort of go out there and really sort of make sure that people kind of what a college degree is worth. I think they've got some work to do in that regard.
Sure.
And I don't think we heard much specifically about certificates, but I think the growth in online graduate programs, $9,900 and MBA, for example, which is mostly online, and maybe you have to come to campus
Okay.
some, but and that goes in that direction a little bit because it's something you sort of do on the side, right? As opposed to really throwing yourself in like you would for an MBA at Wharton or wherever.
Right, right, right. How about tuition discounting? How much did you hear about that?
Well, I mean, I heard a lot about it a few years ago, right? Because a lot of schools were trying, well, not a
Yeah.
lot, but there was a good number of schools I wrote about that were doing. I mean, Cabrini had done that. Rosemont, and in fact, the president of Rosemont, when we talked to him, said that, initially that it helped, but then over time, it really lost its impact, and they were
But you're
sort of
talking,
getting out of the discounting business again. Go ahead, Harold. What were you going to
I'm
say?
sorry, so you're talking there about the tuition reset as
Oh,
opposed
I'm
to
sorry. I
tuition.
thought you meant. I'm sorry. I thought you said tuition. I heard tuition
I did
reset in
say
my head.
tuition discount, but both of those things are important. So,
I heard
Right,
tuition
right.
reset in
So
my head. Sorry, that's what I was.
yeah,
Yes,
no, it's interesting. Like we did talk here some about the tuition discounting and how it's the only way. I mean, they've tried. Like it's funny. I think specifically at Delaware Valley, I think they were talking about this, how they've figured out there's a sweet spot where that's how they get their students is with this certain, I forget what their percentage is, but if you go too far in one direction or another, I mean, well,
yeah,
maybe you can go down, but the thing is, if you go up too much, if you reduce your discount too much, you just lose too many students. It's always that net revenue game.
yeah, yeah. Wasn't Rosemont one of the early triers of the tuition reset program where they were really trying to advertise it? I think it was $25,000 or something like
yes.
that. Yeah, yeah,
They were, and the president Jim Cawley was saying how basically, again, that worked early on, I think, right, but then he said we're back in the business of discounting now. We're back in that business,
Right.
like it just didn't.
And it's funny because LaSalle also followed pretty closely on Rosemont's heels, and those two schools are
Right, LaSalle. Yeah,
really,
about
really
that.
struggling.
How about
yeah,
that?
right. I forgot LaSalle did it too, right? There was
Yeah,
a good number of schools around here that tried it, and I mean, the results were mixed at the time, right, as to whether that works or not, and I don't know. So
yeah, yeah. Um, let's talk about Holy Family a little bit. They seem to be doing things right. What were they doing right? What were they doing well?
Yeah, I mean, it was when we saw the results about Holy Family, we were interested about like what's going on there. I mean, one of the things that came out was like they really don't draw from their endowment for operating expenses. Like that's something they haven't had to do. Like the president's really proud of that, and that's allowed their endowment to grow. That's really helped them.
Although it's still very small.
Yes. What is it? What's it at? I don't even remember exactly. Was it
Like
30 something? I think it was 30 some million,
the
right?
total, I can't remember, but
Yeah. Yeah.
unrestricted is like maybe 25 at this point,
Hmm.
which is a nice reserve
25 million. 25 million.
in unrestricted
And
reserve.
unrestricted. Okay. All right.
And
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure that's right.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
another thing that I think really helps Holy Family too is, like more than 90% of their students come from, I believe, a 25-mile radius of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And they've got a really strong tradition, like up in the Northeast and in Bucks County. Like they really draw like a lot of their students there. And again, it is like sort of a family kind of thing, right? And so I think that has really helped them over time, sort of like really they've got their market. Now they're also doing more with sports and recruiting. In fact, it was funny because when I was out there on campus, I ran into a student who was considering coming in for the lacrosse team. He was from Houston, and he was so I think they're doing some, they are definitely doing some recruiting, athlete recruiting and stuff from other places. And but that's, I think, having that strong regional presence has I think helped them. Perhaps their location, like again their location where they are, it just, I think that's another thing that I think that has helped them. Anything else you can think of, Harold, that
Those are the main things. Although I would
yeah.
also add that their Holy Family's audit for fiscal 2024 was published this week, and it continued to show really solid net tuition revenue growth, but their overall results were significantly weaker. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
hard to maintain.
What are you both seeing in far as, if you dove deep enough into this, I don't know, endowment strategies to grow their endowments? Any particular tips that they talked about?
Call that, I mean, I know generally colleges are on the cycle of doing fundraising campaigns. They especially when a new president comes in, they take some time to figure out what their kind of what their pitch is going to be, what their strategy is going to be, and then they go out and fundraise for it. But I don't, do you remember anything, Harold,
No,
they
and
talked about?
I would say our reporting focused on unrestricted endowments as
Okay.
opposed to the donor restricted endowment portion because the focus was on cash that can be used to cover expenses.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. So as we wrap this up, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think about schools like Gwynedd Mercy and Chestnut Hill and schools in the Allentown area like Alvernia and Albright and those types of things. What kinds of things might you look for as they try to continue to adjust in this new landscape?
To look for in terms of like
Stabilization, number one, and then maybe growth, right?
Well, I would say to me, it's very simple. Can they develop programs that are going to bring revenue in the door? Are they going to,
Okay.
that's what it's all going to come down to.
The academic curriculum.
Yes. And
Yeah.
professional education.
Professional education. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that a lot of the schools are talking about is, because of the traditional aged college student, because those numbers are going to drop, they really have to work harder at getting the non-traditional age people, right, to come into their doors, the adult population. And I mean, I think there was the figure I had today was like, I think there's 1.1 million Pennsylvanians, right, that have some college but no degree. That's a market to go after. But yeah, I mean, I think they're going to have to and I think they are thinking about this. They're talking about looking at other, this other population to try to bring in the door as well. And they're talking about recruiting in other areas as well.
That's what I was going to ask you about. Yeah.
Yeah. They've talked about some of that, about expanding their recruitment area. I think the one region that's expected to grow in terms of high school graduates is the South.
Yes.
Some of them probably going to be looking down there.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the Penn State admissions person had said to me something about, he said something I hadn't heard before, that Illinois is the new New Jersey in terms of how many it's exporting of students to other, out of state to go to college. So like New Jersey had been a leader in that, right now they're saying Illinois is doing
Interesting.
that.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of whether, what are these schools going to do? What kind of programs are they adding? Are they successful? Yeah.
Yeah. Harold, any last thoughts or observations from your research?
I just think it's fascinating to see this. Higher education is such an important part of the Philadelphia region's identity and its economy.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot riding on whether these schools can figure out a way to be sustainable financially.
100%.
I can't predict the future, so
I know. Me
I
neither.
don't have to.
Well, thank you both so much. It's a pleasure to meet both of you. Thank you for your great reporting, covering an area of the country that is dense with higher education. So this is important. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much for
Nice
having
to meet
us.
you.
Absolutely.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Bye-bye.
you too.